The music you can hear in the background is probably the first ever recording of someone covering a Beatles song, a Lennon and McCartney composition, and playing it in public. This recording of P.S. I Love You took place in St Leonard's Church Hall, Bootle, near Liverpool, on the evening of Saturday, the 6th of October 1962, just one day after the official release of the Beatles' first single. That Beatles' first record, with Love Me Do on the A-side and P.S. I Love You on the B-side, came out in the UK on Friday the 5th of October, the day before. At the time, I think it's fair to say that the Beatles could be said to have been very much a Liverpool group. Certainly that's how the teenagers of Liverpool felt about them. The Beatles were not really known nationally in the UK, let alone internationally, and yet amongst the teenagers of Liverpool they were a big deal. Granted, the group had been to Hamburg in Germany and had seen some success there, and they'd had recordings of sorts released on the Polydor label. But the feeling about the Beatles amongst the young people of Liverpool was that they deserved much greater success. And of course, with the involvement of Brian Epstein from January 1962, that success started to emerge. Although Epstein had arranged a few recording sessions in the early part of 1962, by September of that year it was public knowledge in the city that a final recording of the Beatles with the lineup of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr was about to be released. By the following month of that year, October, while the world focused on the impending Cuban Missile Crisis, the music-loving teenagers of Liverpool were perhaps more concerned about the Beatles. For a good number of weeks around that time, the local music press of Liverpool, namely the Merseybeat newspaper, had been encouraging the young people of the city to pre-order and to buy upcoming single of the Beatles. This was important not only for it to gain traction in the local Liverpool music chart, but also for it to do well in the UK national chart. That publication, Merseybeat, came out every 2 weeks, and the copy shown here is dated September 20th to October 4th, 1962. And here's the EMI flyer, which also pushed the single. As mentioned, it was felt to be a big deal amongst young Liverpudlians that the Beatles had at last obtained a proper recording contract, and a number of friends in my part of Bootle had bought copies of the single on the day it was released, Friday the 5th of October 1962. The recording you heard in the background came from a performance at the Harvest Supper concert in St Leonard's Church Hall, Bootle, the day after the record was released. Such harvest weekend celebrations were a reasonably big part of British culture up to the mid-20th century, such that around October time each year there would be an informal social gathering around a meal on the Saturday night, known as the Harvest Supper, and then a celebratory and thankful church service on the Sunday, with the church filled with fruit, vegetables and other food items. The Harvest Supper on the Saturday night would often include a concert of sorts where people would volunteer to do a short entertainment spot. And 4 of us Bootle teenagers, Tony Mathias, Eric Knowles, John Boys and Eddie Boys, were members of that church, and as such we had previously volunteered to play some songs on stage during the Harvest Supper. We had played together a little in the summer of 1962 at the St Leonard's Church Youth Holiday at or near Biggar in Scotland. My recollection of the holiday is of playing Let's Twist Again on acoustic guitars over and over again for the kids to sing and dance to. After that summer holiday, the 4 of us carried on meeting together to play music for fun, and as I say, later volunteered to play some songs at the church's Harvest Supper in the October of that year. We practiced for some weeks with 2 guitars, and we'd built up a bit of equipment, namely a Watkins Copycat echo machine, a cheap set of drums, and a 30-watt tube or valve amplifier with a crystal microphone. Over the weeks, we had prepared a number of the then current pop songs to perform at the concert. However, in our get-together on the Friday night that the Beatles record came out, And in the practice the next day for that evening's concert, we started to learn one of those Beatles songs. We couldn't do Love Me Do, as we didn't have a harmonica, and P.S. I Love You seemed much more straightforward, and in the key of C had a rather nice chord run from A flat to B flat to C, at least the way we played it did. After the final practice on the Saturday afternoon, we decided that we would definitely ditch one of the songs that we'd intended doing and put in P.S. I Love You instead. The final list of the 4 songs that we played that evening were then Things by Bobby Darin, Frightened City by The Shadows, Picture of You by Joe Brown, and P.S. I Love You by the Beatles. That night we recorded the performance by placing a tape recorder on the floor of the stage in the hall. It was a Grundig TK20 with its Magic Eye sound level meter and its rather strangely shaped Grundig capacitor microphone. The only photograph taken of the evening was when our singer Tony Mathias was off stage, and it shows Eddie Boys on rhythm, Eric Knowles on drums and John Boys on lead playing the Shadows song Frightened City. When we came to our final song, P.S. I Love You, John introduced it to the audience by pretending to have found a letter outside the church hall, and he linked it to the postscript words, I love you. The recording of the evening is extremely poor, but it's just possible to make out a good number of the words of that introduction, and before John had finished or mentioned the title of the song, one or more of the girls in the audience seemed to realise immediately what was coming next, and showed some excitement in shouting out the title. Like the rest of us, the teenagers there will have had just over a day or so to get to know the A-side and the B-side of the Beatles' first single, and it's fairly obvious that many of the kids in the hall were quite familiar with the songs. And this is the venue, St Leonard's Church Hall Bootle as it looks in 2023. However, it should be said that the church site and the surrounding housing was very different in the early 1960s when this recording was made. This is quite a recent map of Greater Liverpool at the start of the 21st century, and unlike the somewhat more leafy or even what you might call modern parts of southern Liverpool in which most of the Beatles spent their childhood, with the exception perhaps of Ringo, Dockside Bootle to the north was extremely run down in the 1950s and 60s. It should be remembered that this was only 15 or so years after the end of the Second World War, and like a good number of UK cities, many parts of Liverpool had taken a battering from air raid bombing, and none more so than northern Liverpool, or what might be called Dockside Bootle. This region, shown here in the map of 1935, just before the war, was home to the biggest and most important of the Liverpool docks, Alexandra Dock, Hornby Dock, and then the slightly newer Gladstone Dock. As well as these docks, there were support warehouses and industries, along with the Bootle Gasworks, which was a fairly large coal gas production and storage plant situated about a mile inland. It's been suggested that during the war, a vital contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic was made by this relatively small part of Bootle, and that if, for example, the docks of this area, Gladstone, Hornby, and particularly Alexandra, had been destroyed by bombing, then feeding the people of Britain could well have become extremely difficult. At the start of the war, around 30% of all UK imports came through the port of Liverpool, and those northern docks were responsible for a large proportion of food imports from the USA and from Canada. These 3 docks span the adjacent densely populated terrace streets linked by Knowsley Road, Peel Road, Marsh Lane, Strand Road, Merton Road and Balliol Road inland as far as Hawthorne Road. Of course, all the docks along the Liverpool waterfront were targeted by German bombers, and they were badly damaged, as was much of the city centre. This is a picture of the bombed city centre from the untouched Queen Victoria Monument in Derby Square. However, it was the collateral damage to the homes in the adjacent streets around the city which caused the most immediate human misery. Arguably, on account of its densely populated housing and its proximity to those northern docks and to the industry supporting them, possibly the worst damage came to the region of Dockside Bootle, which was centred on and which surrounded Knowsley Road, Peel Road and Marsh Lane, those terraced streets which had been named by the Victorians after poets, English, Scottish, Irish and North American English-speaking poets and writers. It's this area, along with the regions immediately to the north, south and east of it, which I'm referring to as Dockside Bootle, and it's been suggested that for its size and on account of the density of its population, this area might be said to have taken the heaviest wartime bombing in the UK, and many of those bombs fell onto the rows and rows of terraced houses in these streets named after poets, and onto the local residents who lived there. In the Blitz of 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed this area repeatedly, night after night, and many of the bombs missed the docks and the other industrial targets and exploded amongst the population. One can perhaps appreciate this a little better by looking at this German bomber's map for an actual air raid. Here are the three roads, Knowsley Road, Peel Road and Marsh Lane, marked in red. As one might expect, this document is marked secret, and it would seem that this particular sortie was focusing on Bootle Gasworks, which was between Lineker Lane and Marsh Lane, and it is clearly marked here on the map and numbered 5283. Also marked on the map as 8386 is the Gladstone Graving Dock, and Alexander Dock 5697 with its food silos, and also what looks to be Bootle Fire Station in Strand Road, which is numbered 5689. Here is a pre-war 1938 photograph of the same area from a different perspective, looking from the River Mersey over the Gladstone Dock. There's Knowsley Road, Peel Road and Marsh Lane, up as far as Stanley Road. Here is the gasworks, right in the midst of houses on Hawthorne Road, Litherland Road and Stanley Road. Here is the Gladstone Graving Dock, a stone's throw from my grandparents' house in Knowsley Road. And here is Bootle Fire Station on Strand Road. And so it's easy to appreciate from this, I think, that collateral damage to the homes in and around the Poets' Streets would likely be high from bombing raids on targets anywhere in this region, as would damage to the old original St Leonard's Church, which you can just make out here in the middle of Peel Road, right in the middle of things. It's been reported that from the air raids of the May 1941 Blitz alone, around 80% of the houses in the wider Bootle area were hit or set on fire. Estimates of serious damage suggested that 8,000 out of the 17,000 houses in Bootle, that's 47%, were destroyed or damaged, and most of these, of course, were homes to the families of dockers, dock maintenance workers, merchant seamen and other skilled and manual workers whose vital contribution to the war effort would be subsequently hampered. Here are just a few collections of pictures of the bomb damage that took place in and around the Poets' Streets over the war years. These are just a fraction of the photographs that happened to have been taken after bombs were dropped. And there's perhaps some justification in the suggestion that this particular region might be thought to have sustained the greatest war damage per capita in the UK. In fact, it seemed at one stage that this entire area of Dockside Bootle could well have been wiped out. I believe there was talk after the war of flattening this whole area and starting again, and this led to some uncertainty in terms of rebuilding, which was only really resolved by the early 1950s. As one can imagine, the effect on the people there, many of whose homes had been destroyed, lingered on well beyond the end of the war in 1945. My recollection as a child in the 1950s is that virtually every one of the terraced streets in the Poets area had a number of missing houses from the effect of the wartime bombs, and in some streets whole sections of terraced houses were missing. To post-war youngsters in the area, the baby boomers, the word debris, or as we pronounced it, debris, was synonymous with a play area, and that was true even into the early 60s. A small number of the larger debris were fairly swiftly infilled by the local council with prefabricated homes after the war. They were called prefabs by the locals, and you can see a few of them here on Knowsley Road at the bottom of Cowper Street and Dryden Streets, along with this picture of a single prefab. There were houses like this in many parts of the country and all over Bootle by the 1950s, and most have now been replaced with permanent housing. However, some of the debris were not built upon in that way. This image shows some wartime bomb damage near the bottom end of my own street, Cowper Street, and the gap that was left after demolition of one unsafe house is shown here in 2023 to have been infilled with garages for the local residents. The adjacent street, Dryden Street, had quite a few missing houses and sections of houses, and the particular debris shown here, which I walked across daily to go through the back entry to Cowper Street on my way home from school and from university in the 1950s and 60s, is currently simply boarded up. I was born after the war in the front downstairs room of number 10 Cowper Street, in the room which we called the parlour. Here's the view of that house from above. It shows the top end of Cowper Street and Dryden Street. And the layout of these terrace houses was quite basic. This house, for example, 10 Cowper, simply had 3 rooms on each of 2 floors. And as mentioned, when I was born, the front room was given the rather Victorian title of the parlour and was little used. The main room, the downstairs middle room of the house, which nowadays might be called the lounge or the living room, was in those days called the kitchen and was used as a lounge and a dining room. This was the only room that was heated in cold weather with a coal fire when my mother chose to set it and to light it. Coal, when needed, was ordered from Skilling's coal merchants in Norton Street off Knowsley Road, and sacks of it were then delivered by the coalman. He would tip the sacks of coal into the narrow cellar under the hall via a manhole in the front step of the house. And coalmen were a very common sight in the 1950s and early 60s, until, that is, Britain acquired North Sea gas from the mid to late 60s onwards, and gas fires became much more common. The third downstairs room at the back was where food was prepared and washing was done, even personal washing, there being no bathroom. It had clean, fresh, cold running water and a gas stove, presumably using coal gas from Bootle gasworks nearby. This third room was called in those days the back kitchen, and it led out to a tiled yard, the outside toilet, and to the back door. The alleyways for these back entrances were called by many different names throughout the north of England, but in this part of Bootle, the alleyway itself was simply called the entry. The 3 upstairs rooms of these houses were all bedrooms. And it happens that I was born downstairs in the parlour because at the time the front bedroom was being decorated by my father, and of course there was no National Health Service until 1948. The fact that there was no hot water or bathroom in the houses made personal hygiene a bit of an issue when one was growing up. Clearing people out of the back kitchen for some personal time wasn't easy, and there was no lock on the door. Of course, when we were very young toddlers, we had the occasional family bath time, the water being heated on the gas stove in the back kitchen and then put into a tin bath in front of the coal fire in the kitchen. Kids first, mum next, and dad last. However, into the 1950s, as we grew older, it was a case of booking the back kitchen. And this was later alleviated a little when the local council made available public washing facilities on Knowsley Road. This building was called the Slipper Baths and was built on the debris from war-bombed shops at the bottom of Cowper Street and Dryden Street. The businesses in those pre-war shops had been a pawnbroker's, a sweet shop, a hairdresser's, a funeral director's and a photographer. But after the war, the land had been cleared, perhaps sometime in the late 40s or early 50s, for the building of this public bathhouse. And as far as I can remember, the internal layout of the building was more or less like this. You'd get your ticket from the office. I think in the early years it only cost a few pence, and then you'd wait in the appropriate waiting room. Eventually you'd be called by the attendant, at one stage a Mr. Finnegan of Percy Street, and you'd be given a towel and a block of brown soap. The attendant had a special key with which he could fill the baths, and he did so to a high level with what looked like rust-coloured water, but it was piping hot, and you couldn't adjust the taps yourself. The towels you were given had red or green stripes on them and emblazoned across the middle were the words Bootle Borough Council. I guess in case of theft. I swear the towels had been ironed. They may even have been starched. They were like sandpaper, and they took off as much dirt or dead skin when getting dried as when getting washed. In those days, dock and factory workers received their pay packet weekly, either on a Thursday or a Friday night, which meant that these were the busy times in the slipper baths, so much so that young boys would be allowed to have their bath in the ladies' side of the building on some occasions. And I have to say the baths were somewhat more modern on that side, but still had the same rust-coloured water. However, these slipper baths were a later addition to the routine of life for the people in these streets, and not necessarily used weekly by everyone, so that just after the war and well into the 1960s, most people's personal hygiene would be catered for in the back kitchen of their own homes, until bathrooms and internal toilets and even central heating began to be installed more widely in the late 60s and early 70s. Cleanliness was next to godliness. As was the case in most working-class areas of the country, Cowper Street was a fairly close-knit community. And this photograph shows a gathering of some of the youngsters there in 1946. It may well have been at the 1946 street party celebrating the first anniversary of the end of the war, because I look a little less than 1 year old here. In fact, my recollection as a child of about 2 or 3, a few years after this picture, was being taken by these 2 young girls, Joyce Burgess and their friend Mavis, I think, to play on the debris of St Leonard's Church on Peel Road. The girls took me and some others there in order to play at having a family tea party on the large stones and rubble that was left of the old church. Being in the middle of the Poet Street, St Leonard's Church stood a good chance of being hit by German bombing, and it was in the May of 1941. This picture is a simulated illustration of what the bombed St Leonard's Church may have looked like, no actual photograph being available that I can find. The church was at the top of Cowper Street and Dryden Street, and before the war it had been a thriving Anglican church in the heart of this working class area, having been built in 1889. The church came about because of the expansion of Bootle, which in turn was due to the growth of the City of Liverpool as its dock system stretched northwards. Prior to this expansion in the late 1700s and early 1800s, Bootle had been a quiet rural Lancashire hamlet and had become something of a fashionable bathing resort. Come to Bootle and taste the sea air. By the mid-1800s, however, the expansion of Liverpool northwards was beginning to be noticeable. This map of part of Bootle in 1847 shows that although the docks had not yet reached the village, other things had. The Leeds-Liverpool Canal had been there, of course, from about 1775, but with the coming of the Liverpool to Southport Railway in the 1840s, Bootle got its own railway station around 1850, and the population of the town began to increase. The railway station was called Bootle Village Station and was initially situated close to Merton Road and Coffee House Bridge. However, a few years after 1850 it was moved a little southward to its current position in Oriel Road. Nevertheless, Bootle was still, at that time, a reasonably fashionable seaside resort, with Merton Road running from one end in the old village near Litherland Road, down over Coffee House Bridge, past St Mary's Church to the beach at Bootle Sands. Balliol Road also ran down to the shoreline, going over Miller's Bridge to Miller's Castle. This view of the Bootle shore around 1864 shows the beach at Miller's Castle, which was a large house near the bottom of Miller's Bridge, just off the map here. People were still bathing here in the mid-1800s, just north of the then northernmost Canada Dock, or its later half-time addition, which was renamed Brocklebank Dock. The roads around Merton Road and Balliol Road were becoming filled with large and expensive houses as people moved into the town, within easy commuting distance of Liverpool. Parks and recreational areas were being created, and the importance of the town of Bootle increased. It became a municipal borough in 1868 and a county borough in 1889. And all of this progress and expansion was coupled with and fuelled by an increase in industrialisation. Throughout the 1800s, the port of Liverpool had been growing in size and in prosperity, and its docks were extending northwards along the coast, beginning to dominate the village of Bootle, which is only 3 miles or so to the north of the city. The population of Bootle continued to grow as people moved in to find work, and a good number of those who came were from North Wales. Some, like my grandmothers, came to work in service in the large houses around Balliol Road and Merton Road. Some Welsh folk also came to work in the coal mines near Liverpool, and still others to work on the docks. More significantly, perhaps, was the ongoing immigration of many Irish manual workers and their families, who came to Liverpool and worked on building the docks and on its rail connections. Much like Boston, Massachusetts, Liverpool and Bootle have a significant and influential Irish population to this day. However, towards the end of the 1800s, Bootle underwent a radical change in 1891. This saw the completion of the Langton, Alexandra and Hornby docks to the Liverpool dock system, and they completely took over the Bootle shoreline. Miller's Castles disappeared, and these 3 docks were then the northernmost Liverpool docks around 1900, and they inevitably changed the character of Bootle dramatically. By this time also a great deal of terraced housing had been laid out for the benefit of the workers in and around those docks, including those streets named after poets. And here are some of the early images of 2 of those streets as the late Victorians created them: Boswell Street, looking from Knowsley Road, and Dryden Street, looking down from Peel Road. At this time, some of the Seaforth shore remained intact, and as this photograph shows, was still used for bathing around 1900. However, the part of it nearest to Knowsley Road contained at one stage a number of brickworks, and it was therefore probably inevitable that after 1900 there were plans to build a new dock on the site of those brickworks, the Gladstone Dock, for which more workers would be needed. In fact, my own grandfather, a blacksmith, moved from shoeing horses in the farms of nearby Kirby to live in Knowsley Road, Bootle, in order to work as a toolmaker for the men who were building the Gladstone Dock. When completed in 1927, the Gladstone Dock would then be the northernmost dock of the Liverpool system, and would remain so until the 1970s with the building of the Seaforth Terminal. And so it was that the construction of all those northern docks changed the once quiet rural suburb of Bootle, Lancashire, into a large town, a chartered borough with its own municipal government. It had gone from green fields and pastures having a simple and pleasant shoreline onto the River Mersey and the Irish Sea, and had been transformed into docks, support workshops and warehouses, and of course those terraced streets for the workers. However, in 1893, well before the Gladstone Dock was built, Bishop J.C. Ryle, who was the first Bishop of Liverpool, said this about Bootle: "The spiritual destitution of the rapidly growing township of Bootle attracted my attention from the very beginning of my episcopate, and caused me very great anxiety. I spoke of it everywhere, both publicly and privately, and pressed it on the attention of Liverpool churchmen. It appeared to me that to all intents and purposes a large portion of the dwellers in Bootle were like sheep without a shepherd for any benefit they had received from the established Church of England." In particular, I believe Bishop Ryle was meaning what I've been calling Dockside Bootle, the area of the poet streets and of those streets surrounding them. Other parts of Bootle had their parish churches at the time. Christ Church, consecrated in 1866 in the somewhat more affluent area of Merton Road, and St Mary's Church, consecrated in 1827, which, although originally close to the seaside part of the old Bootle village, was at this stage beginning to be affected by its proximity to the new Langton, Alexandra and Hornby docks. However, it was this more recent working class community in and around the Poet Streets to the north which seemed to have been overlooked by the Anglican Church in the rush to build of the late 1800s. J.C. Ryle became the first Bishop of Liverpool in 1880, and he made the statement about Dockland Bootle 13 years later in 1893, and in the years that followed he continued to push the idea of building a church in the area wherever and whenever he could. So after much hard work and negotiation by Archdeacon Lefroy and others, a church was eventually built for the people in the area of the Poets' Streets. And in November 1889, 4,000 souls gathered around the new building on Peel Road for its dedication. One of the leaders of that dedication service was the first vicar, the Reverend J. Denton Thompson, who would later become the Bishop of Sodor and Man in 1912. The sermon for the dedication service was preached by the then Archbishop of York, William Thompson, who was sometimes nicknamed Prince William of York, or more generally the People's Archbishop. St Leonard's Church Bootle was born. And this is how it looked from Peel Road around 1895. And this is the view from Bibby's Lane looking towards the top of Dryden Street. Shakespeare Street hadn't been built yet. The interior of the church was apparently quite impressive. Here's a photograph of the very front of the old church looking towards the communion table. The windows seem to be quite plain, as far as one can tell, but the reredos looks rather elaborate. This church of St Leonard is known as one of a number of Ryle churches in Liverpool on account of the fact that it was proposed and fought for by J.C. Ryle. The total building cost of St Leonard's was of the order of £9,000, and 2 years after the church was completed, the parish hall was also finished and opened, and was dedicated on the 10th of October 1891. The hall looks rather small on this photograph, but the side view of it, from Rimrose Road looking across the wasteland, which would later become a children's park, shows the full extent of the structure. It contains 7 rooms, and soon after its completion was used for up to 1,300 children every Sunday, and for talks, classes and meetings of various kinds during the week. Here's another view of that side of the parish hall. This picture shows the ceremonial opening of the children's park in the June of 1908. The parish hall can clearly be seen on the left, along with some brand new seesaws for the children. Also visible are the chairs laid out in front of the park keeper's hut for the opening ceremony. This hut remained intact and was manned right up until the late 1960s or 70s, I think, when it was demolished. However, thinking back to the 1890s, as the years went on, the young church of St Leonard's flourished. In 1891, the local newspaper, the Bootle Times, quoted Sir William Bower Forward, who was a wealthy shipowner and local politician, and was one of the people who raised money for the building of the overhead railway. The Bootle Times quoted him as saying that, as a resident, it gave him great pleasure to testify to the good and solid work being done in connection with St Leonard's. 2 years ago they had not a church. Now it was filled to overflowing with church organisations of every kind in their midst. The great success which had attended the vicar's efforts was due to the fact that he had realised there was a social as well as a spiritual side to their religious work. One particular example of the former related to the sanitation of the local area. After some complaints by the parishioners in the congregation, the Church Council of St Leonard's discussed the problem and sent a letter to the local health committee in which it drew attention to the smells coming from sewers and ash pits and called for reform. The letter was apparently discussed in an angry debate at Bootle Town Hall, in which aldermen and councillors were somewhat scathing of St Leonard's and of its championing of the people's cause. However, it did seem to give a push in the right direction as regards the sanitation policy within the council. The growth of St Leonard's Church from 1900 onwards was based on simple aspects of outreach and mission. For example, at the close of an evening service, the church would form a robed procession, which would move through the different poets' streets of the parish each night, singing well-known hymns. Leaflets had been printed and were distributed. Short appeals were made in the streets on their way, and the procession made its way back to church for yet another crowded service, at which an evangelistic message was given. The church had a strong men's ministry and youth work. For example, the church held special monthly service for men, and even though early attendances were only around 70, they soon grew to about 1,000 men of varying ages and backgrounds. This led eventually to other things such as the starting of an orchestral society and a social club, as well as what was called a sick and burial friendly society, a kind of not-for-profit insurance system into which people could pay voluntary contributions to alleviate funeral expenses. This early growth of St Leonard's was such that when it started it could only really guarantee a handful of people in the congregation. But after 4 years, attendances at the various services in the church, including the monthly men's meeting and the activities in the parish hall such as the Sunday school, reached well over 4,000. This trend continued with its inevitable ups and downs throughout the first half of the 20th century, right up to the Second World War. Throughout this time there was a solid emphasis on preaching the gospel, Bible teaching and social concern. The work of the church followed the pattern offered by Bishop Ryle all those years earlier in 1893, namely loving aggression, bold evangelism, regular house-to-house visitation, plain simple direct preaching of the old-fashioned gospel and constant fervent prayer. By 1939, however, Britain was at war. You could say that the first major air raid or bombing blitz that Liverpool experienced was in the August of 1940 and included what Churchill called the single worst incident of the war in terms of loss of life. This was when, in November 1940, a bomb hit an air raid shelter in Durning Road in the Edge Hill area of Liverpool, quite away from Dockside Bootle to the north. About 300 people had been packed into the basement shelter when the building took a direct hit from a parachute mine and collapsed, killing 166 people and injuring many others. Boiling water poured in from the central heating system and the gas pipes burst, causing intense fires which were difficult to deal with. Some body parts could not be recovered, and the area was eventually treated with lime and sealed off. It's been reported that one woman lost 4 children that night and didn't speak for 6 months. The memorial to the Durning Road bomb is now in Kensington Primary School. This kind of bombing continued over the months that followed, and inevitably Bootle docks were a strategic target for those blitz raids by the Luftwaffe. The Poet Streets and their surroundings were starting to be peppered with bombed-out homes, and at some point in that early period the parish hall of St Leonard's Church was taken over as a rest centre for those families which had been made homeless by the bombing. The people of the church were also involved in other practical aspects of relief. For example, it's reported that on one Sunday morning the church service was stopped just a few minutes after it had started in order to allow the women of the congregation to go home and cook emergency meals for an influx of people whose homes had been bombed the night before. The food on that occasion had been donated by the nearby Richmond Sausage Company of Bridge Road in Litherland. All of this was before the big one, the May Blitz of 1941, when the Luftwaffe bombarded the city of Liverpool to the devastation of much of it, which is to be so crushing for the people of Bootle. In particular, on the evening of Friday the 2nd of May 1941, a firebomb lodged in an inaccessible place between the tower of St Leonard's Church and the roof, and this proved to be the end of the old St Leonard's Church, almost 52 years after it had been built. As mentioned, this picture is an attempt to recreate what the church may have looked like after the bombing, as there seems to be no photograph available of the devastation. The following Saturday morning, people gathered outside what remained of the church building, and they were in tears. Many of them had also lost their homes, but it seemed to be the loss of the church building that encapsulated their sorrow. It was not, of course, the end of the church congregation. The vicarage was to one side of the parish hall, and even though it had received some damage from the bombing, the next day, Sunday, a small group of faithful worshippers met in the dining room of the vicarage for morning prayer and for a celebration of Holy Communion. The life of the church continued. Clearly, the years of the war that were left after this bombing in 1941 were filled with much uncertainty for the church and for the people of the area. Would such prolonged and vicious air raids like the May Blitz start again? In 1941, as it turned out, the people of Britain had 4 more years of wartime hardship. Would it be safe and sensible to hold church services while hostilities continued? And looking further ahead, would the accumulating war debt of the country ever allow churches to be compensated in any way for the loss of the buildings? And what about the future of Dockland Bootle itself? Could it survive after the way it had been decimated? On top of that, the vast majority of the people who looked to the church in pre-war years had been dispersed. There was only a small nucleus of people who'd remained faithful and enthusiastic about the work of the church through the most difficult times. Against this uncertain background, those faithful few continued to worship during the war. First in the vicarage dining room, which was about the only habitable room in it, and then in a kind of war canteen which had been erected to the side of the parish hall and adjacent to the nearby children's park. If we take away the drawing of the vicarage here, you'll see an attempt to illustrate what this building was like. It was a bit like an army hut, and many years later would be known as the Old Hall. However, during the rest of the war years, this canteen was used as the church building, although apparently blackout was something of a problem, which meant that evening services would take place in the afternoon. The services were led first by the vicar, the Reverend Armitage, and then, after his sudden death in 1942, by the new incumbent, the Reverend Adamson. His induction took place in the open air, in front of a simple wooden cross set amongst the rubble of where the communion table of the old church had been. Both of these wartime incumbents and the congregation had been determined, despite uncertainties, to try and move forward with some kind of building work once the war was over. And towards this end, the church magazine was revived with the forward-looking title of The Outlook, and the teaching of young people in Sunday school continued, inasmuch as their elders and teachers could spare time from their wartime duties, whether it was serving as voluntary firefighters, feeding and supporting the homeless, or other semi-organised home guard type of public duties. In the same period, the St Leonard's Restoration Fund was started with a view to building a new church structure eventually, and money began to be collected. Once the war was over in 1945, there were numerous street celebrations in Bootle and indeed all over the country. This is a photograph taken near the bottom of Dryden Street, looking down towards Knowsley Road during one of those celebrations, almost certainly the VE Day anniversary of 1946. These are presumably the party organisers, and this is their get-together. In each of these pictures you can see the old air raid shelter still in the middle of the street. At this time, St Leonard's Church was in ruins, and although the parish hall had been badly damaged, I can testify that it was still standing a few years after that, and for a short period of time, part of it was to some extent usable. I recall as a young child being sent by my mother in Cowper Street up to the parish hall to stand in a queue for a new ration book. The memory stayed with me because, under pressure from some women in the queue, I allowed them to get in front of me, and other women further back in the queue told me off. During that early post-war period, although the church was alive, as a fairly small congregation, there was still great uncertainty about the Dockland area of Bootle in which it was situated. Was it sensible to have the nation's food supply so dependent on imports and on areas like Bootle and its docks? Should the whole area of Dockside Bootle, pitted as it was with bomb sites, be bulldozed and rezoned for factories rather than houses, factories which could mass-produce cheap exports to help pay back the war debt of the country? However, even with this uncertainty, by 1949 the site of the old church had been cleared, and I'm not sure, but the parish hall may have been taken down by then as well. The old hut was still there, as was the vicarage, which was now habitable, and in that year, 1949, work on building the new church was started. The foundation stone was laid by the Bishop of Liverpool, Clifford Martin, seen here with the vicar, the Reverend Adamson, at the ceremonial laying of that stone. The new building was to be a temporary structure, and here's an attempt to illustrate that. Although described as semi-permanent or temporary, this structure was certainly more substantial than the previous asbestos-type hut, which was then used as the church hall. The new church building opened in February 1950 and can be seen here, looking from further along Peel Road, during a Sunday school walk of witness some years later in 1963. The building, though simple and straightforward, had a distinctive interior with an electronic organ, choir stalls and a lighting scheme which gave it a sense of spaciousness. This is the view from the front of the church looking out to the congregation during a monthly church parade service with all the children present in about 1960. And this is a picture of some of those people leaving church after that service, with Peel Road and the top of Cowper Street in the background. It may be of interest here that this shop in 1960, one of the Scots bakery shops which sold bread and the like, is the same one in a picture shown earlier in connection with the war damage in the early 1940s. This shows the aftermath of a bomb in Peel Road during the war just outside the vicarage. However, thinking back to 1950 when the church was first opened, there had previously been a long process of negotiation between the Church Council, the War Damage Commission, municipal planning and the Liverpool Diocesan Church authorities, which meant that the building could not be any larger, any more elaborate or any more permanent. And this was because the decision about industrialisation and the future of Dockside Bootle was still pending. At that time it was thought that it might be best for the houses in the area to be razed to the ground and all of the land used for industrial purposes. However, by the early 1950s, the future of the terraced houses and homes in the Poets' streets around St Leonard's was assured, and there were by that time no plans for using Dockside Bootle simply for industry. And all of this more or less coincided with the positive feelings generated by the Festival of Britain in the summer of 1951, and with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth 2 years later. The first of these celebrations in 1951 was set up to promote Britain and its accomplishments, and although it took place mainly in London, there were some celebrations around the country. However, the people of the United Kingdom, including the people of Bootle, really celebrated in the June of 1953 for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. 9 and 12-inch television sets were becoming affordable to the masses. Apparently over 1 million had been sold in the years before 1953. On top of that, the BBC had upped its game so that the coronation was to be the largest outside broadcast ever undertaken up to that time. And all of this led to an average of 17 people on the day of the coronation being huddled around every one of the TV sets that had been purchased. The national celebrations were such that most working class people had their own street party. Here is a picture of the coronation party held in Cowper Street, Bootle, just outside my house, number 10. None of my relatives seems to be in this picture, but here are a few suggestions for the names of some of the people shown here, which should be mostly correct. And in 2023, the view would be this. And then back to the party of 1953 from a different angle, again with some suggested names. Now, even though this was 8 years after the war, it's probably reasonable to assume that the celebratory feel for many people still included a factor relating to the relief felt by the ending of wartime hostilities. Also, with regard to the Church of St Leonard's, the fact that it had by that time been decided not to replace the houses in the area by an industrial estate meant that full compensation for wartime destruction of the former parish hall became available. Plans were then set in place for that money to be used to build a brand new purpose-built hall on the site of the previous parish hall, and this was completed and opened in December 1955. Again, taking away the drawing of the vicarage, you can appreciate roughly how the new hall positioned itself next to what became known as the Old Hall, the long asbestos-type wartime canteen hut which was next to the children's park. In this picture of 1963 taken from further along Peel Road, you can just see the new hall in the background, behind the church and next to the vicarage. The outward appearance of the hall has not really changed in the years since it was built in 1955, as this photograph from around 2023 illustrates. At the time the new hall was being planned and built in the 1950s, prices for such things had rocketed, and so there was a sense in which the compensation and money available could only afford a building which still had something of a utility feel to it. It couldn't have an elaborate exterior. However, people were grateful for the facility. After the devastation of the war, the church was beginning to grow under the ministry of Reverend Adamson, and there were a good number of church organisations which ran each week. The Life Boys and Boys Brigade was strong, as illustrated in this picture from about 1953, a few years before the new hall was built. Similarly, Brownies and Guides were doing well, along with the Sunday schools and less formal youth work. The new hall meant that all of these, along with other adult groups, gained space, comfort, and a freedom from outside interference, all without particularly high running costs. And it was a few years later, in 1957, that the vicar, the Reverend A.S. Adamson, decided that it was time for him to move on. And so after 13 years at St Leonard's, he left to take up a post in St Andrew's Clubmoor in Liverpool. His incumbency at St Leonard's had included many difficult pressures: the war years, the absence of a church building, the effect of the war on his congregation, and the many problems involved in rebuilding both the church building and the church hall. The new vicar was instituted and inducted in June 1957, the Reverend John F. Mockford. He was a posh-spoken Cambridge graduate from Bromley in Kent, but the people of Bootle quickly took to him. It soon became clear that he'd taken up the axiom of J.C. Ryle from 1893. That bishop had said about St Leonard's that the work of the church should follow the pattern of loving aggression, bold evangelism, regular house-to-house visitation, plain, simple, direct preaching of an old-fashioned gospel, and constant, fervent prayer. And John Mockford made sure that these were the priorities. Here are some of the early highlights of his ministry at St Leonard's as the church grew in the years that followed 1957. In conjunction with other churches in Bootle, there was a rather large Bootle-wide mission in 1959, and this was immediately followed for the St Leonard's people with a Bible teaching course at the church. John Mockford and a number of other church folk were also involved in weekly open-air meetings outside the gates of the Gladstone Dock, just down the road from St Leonard's. This attracted some workmen and their families to join the church, and it's reported that at one of these open-air meetings, a former coal miner, the Reverend Joe Kitts, seen here in his retirement, was speaking to the men, and he said that his bitch looked after her pups much better than they looked after their children. And while some of the church people there and the clergy raised their eyebrows, the men who were listening took it on the chin. Another memorable event was in 1960 when the whole parish was involved in a massive stewardship campaign which was led by Canon Lindsay. You can see here the stewardship meal that was held in the new church hall at the start of the campaign. This was aimed mainly at the church family, but a good number of the people in this photograph were not necessarily regular church attenders. There seemed to be a willingness among some of the locals to help the church out, as though it belonged to them or they owed it something. In the following year, the church was heavily involved with the Billy Graham Crusade in Manchester in the May of 1961. Busloads of people were taken from the Poet Streets to the Main Road football ground in Manchester each night to hear Billy Graham or his stand-in speak. Later, in the spring of 1962, the curate, the Reverend Colin Baisley, and the church organised a really impressive missionary exhibition which drew in lots of people from other churches and other denominations around Liverpool. It was organised to see the extent of and the need for missionary and aid work around the world and to encourage more involvement in that work. All the while, during this period from 1959 to 1962, the vicar, John Mockford, was aided by a number of excellent curates: Colin Baisley, Ian Bunting, and Keith Anderson. Their ministries at the church overlap to some extent, and they can be seen here in this photograph when they were at one point present all together outside the church vicarage. And so we come to the Harvest Festival Supper of the 6th of October 1962, which is what this video was supposed to be all about. Much more could be said about Bootle and the Poets' Streets, and of course about the whole of Liverpool in terms of the way it bounced back after the war, up to and beyond 1962. More could be said also about the work of St Leonard's Church after 1962, and about the many people who contributed to that work. But perhaps all of that is for another day.